Racist Officer Tases' black mother holding baby. Not knowing her husband is police chief, a horrifying act against a mother and child sparks outrage. But her husband's position will ensure accountability. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The spring afternoon in Atlanta's Piedmont Park started like any other. Parents pushed strollers along winding paths, children chased each other across freshly cut grass, and the sun cast long shadows through the oak trees. Sophia Carter stood near a wooden bench, gently bouncing her 6-month-old son Marcus, who had been crying inconsolably for the past 15 minutes. Her brown curls were pulled back in a messy bun, and exhaustion lined her face as she tried every trick she knew to calm her son. Nearby, families continued their activities, some casting sympathetic glances at the struggling mother. A group of teenagers played frisbee, their laughter mixing with Marcus's cries. Sophia had chosen this spot specifically because it was usually peaceful, a place where she could clear her head after long days at the community center where she worked as a counselor. Officer Tyler Brown's patrol car rolled slowly past the park's entrance. He was responding to a noise complaint 3 blocks away, but the sound of crying caught his attention. Through the car window, he observed Sophia's increasingly frustrated movements. His hand instinctively moved to his radio, but he hesitated before calling it in. Brown had been on the force for 8 years, and something about this scene didn't sit right with him. He pulled the car over and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The afternoon heat made his uniform stick to his back as he approached the scene. Brown's training had taught him to assess situations quickly, but his assessments often relied more on ingrained prejudices than actual threat evaluation. He watched as Sophia paced back and forth, her movements becoming more agitated as Marcus's cries intensified. Several park-goers noticed Brown's approach. A woman sitting on a nearby bench gathered her children closer. 2 joggers slowed their pace, their eyes fixed on the developing situation. The atmosphere shifted from casual weekend leisure to tangible tension in a matter of seconds. Sophia remained focused on Marcus, unaware of Brown's presence until he was less than 10 feet away. When she finally noticed him, she turned slightly, instinctively shielding Marcus with her body. The baby's cries grew louder. "Ma'am," Brown called out, his hand resting on his belt. "Is everything all right here?" Sophia nodded quickly, her voice strained but controlled. "Yes, officer. My son is just having a difficult moment. We're fine." Brown took another step forward, his training screaming at him that something was wrong. In his mind, the scenario began to morph. The crying baby became a potential victim. Sophia's protective stance registered as suspicious behavior. Her quick response seemed rehearsed. "I'm going to need you to put the baby down," Brown ordered, his voice carrying across the now silent park area. Sophia's eyes widened. "Officer, please. He's my son. He's just crying." Brown reached for his taser, interpreting her refusal as resistance. "Put the baby down now." The next few seconds unfolded in slow motion. Sophia turned further away, trying to protect Marcus. Brown, seeing only defiance, pulled his taser and fired. The probe struck Sophia in her back, sending electricity coursing through her body. Her muscles seized, her grip on Marcus failed, and the baby slipped from her arms. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers as Marcus fell. A nearby teenager lunged forward, managing to partially break the baby's fall, but couldn't prevent Marcus's head from hitting the ground. Sophia collapsed, her body convulsing from the taser's current. Screams erupted from all directions. Parents grabbed their children and ran. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, recording the aftermath. Brown stood frozen, his taser still pointed at Sophia's twitching form. Marcus's cries had turned to piercing shrieks. The teenager who had tried to catch him was shouting for someone to call an ambulance. The peaceful park had transformed into a scene of chaos and horror in less than a minute. Within moments, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Park visitors who hadn't fled were clustering in small groups, their phones raised, documenting every detail. Brown finally lowered his taser, the reality of what he'd done beginning to sink in. He just tasered an unarmed mother holding a baby, and he had no justification for his actions. Richard Carter was in the middle of a budget meeting when his personal phone vibrated against his desk. As Atlanta's chief of police, he'd trained himself to ignore such interruptions, but something made him glance at the screen. 3 missed calls from the hospital and 1 from his patrol supervisor. His stomach tightened as he excused himself from the meeting. In the hallway of police headquarters, Richard listened to the first voicemail, his dark complexion paling with each word. "Chief Carter, this is regarding your wife, Sophia. There's been an incident at Piedmont Park involving one of your officers. She's been transported to Grady Memorial." He didn't finish listening. His keys were in his hand before the voicemail ended, his broad shoulders tense as he strode toward the parking garage. Officers and administrative staff stepped aside, recognizing the barely contained storm in their chief's expression. 20 years on the force had taught Richard to control his emotions, but this was different. This was Sophia. During the drive to the hospital, his mind raced through possibilities. As one of the few black police chiefs in the department's history, Richard had spent his career walking a tightrope between reform and tradition. He'd implemented diversity training, pushed for community policing initiatives, and fought against the institutional racism he'd witnessed firsthand. Now, that same system had somehow hurt his wife. The hospital parking lot was already crowded with news vans. Richard pulled into his reserved space, noting the cluster of reporters gathering near the emergency entrance. Someone had tipped them off. Inside, the emergency department was a maze of controlled chaos. A nurse recognized him immediately. "Chief Carter, this way," she said, leading him through double doors into the treatment area. "Your wife is stable, but she's still unconscious. The baby is being examined in pediatrics." Richard's heart stopped. "Marcus? What happened to Marcus?" The nurse hesitated. "He fell when the taser was deployed. The doctors are running tests to rule out any serious injury." Richard leaned against the wall, his 6'2" frame suddenly feeling unsteady. A taser. One of his officers had tasered his wife while she was holding their baby. The implications hit him like physical blows. The danger to Sophia, the risk to Marcus, the political fallout, the betrayal of trust. Sophia lay motionless on the hospital bed, monitoring equipment beeping steadily beside her. The taser probes had been removed, leaving angry red marks on her back. Her face was peaceful in unconsciousness, but Richard could see dried tears on her cheeks. He took her hand, his thumb running over her wedding ring. Dr. Martinez entered the room, clipboard in hand. "Chief Carter, your wife's vital signs are stable. The taser shock was standard voltage, but the fall caused some additional bruising. We're monitoring her for signs of concussion and cardiac irregularities, standard procedure in taser cases." She paused. "I have to ask, would you like to file a formal report about this incident?" Richard's jaw tightened. Of course there would be a report. There would be investigations, interviews, media coverage, and protests. He could all read. Why imagine the headlines? Police chief's wife tasered in park. The incident would become a symbol, another example of police overreach, another reason for the community to distrust law enforcement. But looking at Sophia's unconscious form, Richard couldn't think about the political implications. His wife, the community organizer who spent her days helping troubled youth, who believed in second chances and redemption, had been attacked by the very system he represented. The irony was bitter. A young officer appeared in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable. "Chief, there's something you need to see." He held out his phone, showing a social media video already going viral. The footage was shaky but clear enough. Sophia with Marcus, the officer approaching, the taser deployment, the baby falling. Richard watched it 3 times, his professional detachment crumbling with each viewing. He recognized the officer in the video. Tyler Brown. 3 complaints of excessive force in the past 2 years, all dismissed after review. Richard had defended him, believing in rehabilitation over punishment. Now, watching Brown taser his wife without provocation, Richard questioned every decision he'd made as chief. By nightfall, the crowd outside the police station had swollen to hundreds. Maya Johnson, a civil rights attorney and Sophia's closest friend since law school, stood on the steps, her voice carrying over the assembled protesters. Her natural hair framed her face like a halo under the street lights as she addressed the crowd. Today, we witnessed what too many of us have experienced. Maya's voice rang out, steady and clear. A mother, holding her crying baby, was attacked by someone sworn to protect and serve. That mother is my friend, Sophia Carter, and yes, she's married to Police Chief Richard Carter. But this isn't about who she's married to. It's about every black mother who lives in fear that a moment of normal parenting could end in violence. The crowd responded with chants and raised fists. News cameras captured every moment, their lights creating harsh shadows across the gathering. Signs bobbed above the crowd. Justice for Sophia. Protect black mothers. Who do you serve? Inside the police station, Richard sat in his office, watching the live coverage on multiple screens. Each monitor showed a different angle of the growing protest. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the hospital, the mayor, the police union, civil rights organizations, media outlets. Everyone wanted a statement, a position, a plan of action. Captain Stevens knocked and entered without waiting. Chief, the union rep is here. They're saying Brown followed protocol, that he perceived a threat and responded accordingly. Stevens shifted uncomfortably. They're preparing to defend him if charges are filed. Richard stared at his computer screen, where the video of Sophia's tasering played on loop. Protocol? His voice was dangerously quiet. Show me where protocol says to taser an unarmed mother holding an infant. Look, Rich, Stevens leaned forward, lowering his voice. We all feel terrible about what happened to Sophia, but you know how these situations can spiral. The department needs a united front. Through his office window, Richard could see more protesters arriving. The crowd now stretched around the block. Among them were several of his officers' wives and children, a detail that wouldn't escape the media's notice. His desk phone buzzed. Chief, Officer Brown is here. He's requesting to speak with you. Richard's hand hovered over the intercom button. Part of him wanted to face Brown to understand what could possibly justify his actions. Another part feared that any direct interaction would compromise the inevitable investigation. Tell him to speak with Internal Affairs. Richard responded finally. And Stevens? Give me everything on Brown. Every complaint, every performance review, every body cam footage. Everything. As Stevens left, Richard's personal phone lit up with a text from Maya. She's awake. Marcus is okay. No serious injuries. She wants to see you. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by renewed anger. His wife and son were safe, but they should never have been in danger in the first place. The system he'd spent his career trying to reform had nearly destroyed his family. A commotion in the hallway drew his attention. Several officers were clustered around a desk, watching footage from the ongoing protest. Richard caught fragments of their conversation. Complaints about professional agitators, dismissive comments about the protesters' legitimacy. That could have been any of our wives, a female officer said suddenly, silencing her colleagues. Any of our children. Are we really going to pretend this was okay? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Richard recognized the speaker, Officer Sarah Chun, a recent transfer with a strong record of community engagement. Her words seemed to split the group, some nodding in agreement, others turning away in discomfort. Richard's desk phone buzzed again. The mayor wanted an immediate meeting to discuss containment strategies. The choice of words made Richard's jaw clench. They were already trying to minimize this, to treat it as a PR problem rather than a symptom of deeper issues. Outside, Maya's voice rose again. We demand immediate action. No paid leave, no quiet resignation, no sweeping this under the rug. Officer Brown must be held accountable. The crowd's response was thunderous. Richard watched as more of his officers' families joined the protesters. The lines between police and community, already blurred by his marriage to Sophia, were becoming increasingly complex. This wasn't just another case of police misconduct. It was a moment that would force everyone in the department to choose sides. At the hospital, Sophia sat upright in her bed, one hand gently stroking Marcus's head as he finally slept in her arms. Maya stood by the window, watching protesters march past the hospital with candles and signs. The room was dim, peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil outside. "You need to speak out," Maya said, turning to face her friend. "What happened to you isn't just assault. It's a symbol of everything we've been fighting against. People need to hear your voice." Sophia looked down at Marcus, tracing the small bump on his head where he'd hit the ground. The doctors had assured her he would be fine, but she couldn't shake the terror of watching him fall. "I keep thinking about Richard," she said quietly. "Everything he's worked for, everything he's tried to change from within the system. This isn't about Richard's career," Maya interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "This is about justice, about making sure no other mother has to watch her baby fall because an officer couldn't see past his own prejudices." Before Sophia could respond, Richard appeared in the doorway. He looked exhausted, his usually pristine uniform wrinkled from the long day. The sight of his wife and son, safe but wounded, made his throat tight. "The community leaders want to meet," he said, stepping into the room. "Reverend Jackson, Dr. Williams, the heads of 3 civil rights organizations. They're waiting in the conference room downstairs." Sophia reached for his hand. "Go. They need to see you're taking this seriously." The hospital's conference room was packed when Richard arrived. Reverend Jackson, a tall man with gray-streaked hair, stood as he entered. "Chief Carter, we're here as friends," he began, "but this situation demands more than friendly words." Dr. Williams, head of the Urban League's local chapter, nodded. "Your officers are scared, Richard. The community is angry. We need concrete action, not just promises of investigation." Richard loosened his tie, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "I understand, but I need you to understand something too. This isn't just about my position as chief. This incident," he paused, controlling his emotion. "This was my wife, my son. I can't just make a policy change and expect that to fix everything." "No one expects you to fix everything," Reverend Jackson said. "But you have a unique opportunity here. You're both the symbol of the system and a victim of it. Use that." As the meeting continued, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from his father, retired Officer James Carter. "Son, you need to handle this carefully. Remember where your loyalty lies." The message hit Richard like a physical blow. His father had been on the force for 30 years, part of the old guard that resisted every attempt at reform. Richard had grown up hearing stories about the necessary roughness of police work, about keeping order at any cost. A memory surfaced, one he'd tried to forget. He was 12, listening to his father and other officers discuss the accident that left a black teenager paralyzed. They called it unfortunate but necessary, closed ranks around the officer responsible. Richard had watched his father lie in court, sworn testimony that protected the department but destroyed a family's hope for justice. Now, decades later, history was repeating itself. The same system, the same excuses, the same expectation that he would choose the badge over justice. But this time, it wasn't some distant victim. It was Sophia. Marcus, his family. Back in Sophia's room, Maya was helping her prepare a statement for the press. Sophia's voice was strong despite her exhaustion. "I won't be silent. Not just for Marcus and myself, but for every mother who's been seen as a threat instead of a human being." Richard stood in the doorway, watching his wife transform her pain into purpose. He thought about his father's text, about the decades of calculated silence that had allowed these incidents to continue. The choice before him wasn't really a choice at all. Richard sat at his desk at 3 a.m., surrounded by personnel files and body camera footage. On his computer screen, a different version of Tyler Brown appeared in each video, sometimes aggressive, sometimes uncertain, but always quick to escalate. The pattern was clear, but he'd missed it, or perhaps he'd chosen not to see it. He clicked through witness statements from the park incident. A college student who recorded the video, a mother who'd been playing with her kids nearby, a retired teacher who'd tried to help Sophia after she fell. Their accounts aligned perfectly. There had been no threat, no justification for Brown's actions. His phone lit up with a message from a local news station. Protests spreading to other cities. Sophia Carter becoming national symbol of police reform movement. Your comment. Outside his office window, the city sparkled with an uneasy energy. Half the force was on overtime, monitoring protests that had sprung up across Atlanta. The other half was dealing with a surge of support for Brown from police unions and conservative groups, who painted him as a victim of political correctness. Chief, Detective Rodriguez appeared in his doorway, holding a tablet. "You need to see this." Security footage from 3 weeks ago, showing Brown's interaction with another mother at a shopping center. Nearly identical situation, but no tossing. The difference? She paused. The mother was white. Richard's jaw tightened as he watched the footage. Brown handling the situation with patience, offering help, showing exactly the kind of community policing they trained for. The contrast with Sophia's incident was damning. His desk phone rang, the mayor again. "Richard, the media's turning this into a circus. We've got protests in 5 cities now. Brown's lawyer is claiming harassment. Your father's giving interviews defending traditional policing methods. We need to get ahead of this." "With all due respect, sir," Richard replied, his voice firm, "getting ahead of this means telling the truth. No spin, no protection, no excuses." After hanging you, Richard opened his email to find hundreds of messages from other police chiefs across the country. Some offered support. Others warned him about maintaining department solidarity. A few shared similar stories, incidents buried under paperwork and silence. A knock on his door revealed Sarah Chun, the officer who'd spoken up earlier. "Chief, the union rep is pressuring officers to sign a statement supporting Brown. They're saying our careers depend on it." Richard stood, his decision crystallizing. "Officer Chun, gather everyone in the main conference room. Everyone who's not on active patrol. Now!" Within 30 minutes, the conference room was packed. Richard stood at the front, Brown's personnel file in his hands. "I've spent the night reviewing every complaint, every incident, every piece of footage involving Officer Brown. What I found isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about a system that saw the warnings and chose to ignore them." He began projecting videos on the wall, incident after incident, showing Brown's pattern of escalation, particularly with minorities. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Some of you have been pressured to support Officer Brown. Some of you have been told that loyalty to the badge means defending any action taken by an officer. But I'm here to tell you that real loyalty, to our oath, to our community, to justice, demands more. In the back of the room, several officers shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded, including Chun and Rodriguez. "Starting now, we're conducting a full review of every use of force incident in the past 5 years. Every complaint, every suspension, every unofficial warning that got buried. And we're doing it with civilian oversight." The room erupted in murmurs. Richard raised his hand for silence. "This isn't about politics. This isn't about public relations. This is about my wife, who nearly lost our son because an officer saw her as a threat instead of a mother. And it's about every other person who's been viewed through that same distorted lens." As he spoke, his phone buzzed with another text from his father. "You're destroying everything we built. Don't let them turn you against your own." Richard looked at the message, then at the faces of his officers. The choice between preserving a broken system and fighting for real change had never been clearer. The Martin Luther King Jr. Center bustled with activity as Sophia and Maya organized what would become Atlanta's largest peaceful demonstration in decades. Despite still recovering from her injuries, Sophia moved through the crowd of volunteers with purpose, her voice steady as she gave instructions. "Remember, we're not here for revenge," Sophia addressed the gathering of mothers, activists, and community members. "We're here for change. Real, lasting change." She adjusted Marcus in his carrier, his presence a constant reminder of why this mattered. Maya worked nearby, coordinating with legal observers and protest marshals. "We've got permits for the entire route. Medical teams will be stationed every few blocks. And we've got live streamers ready to document everything." The march would trace a symbolic path, starting at the park where Sophia was tasered, passing the police station, and ending at City Hall. Over 5,000 people had already confirmed their attendance, with more joining every hour. Mrs. Carter, a young mother, approached Sophia, holding her own infant. "I was there that day in the park. I couldn't sleep for days thinking about what happened to you. What could have happened to my baby?" Sophia reached out and squeezed the woman's hand. "That's why we're here." so our children won't have to grow up afraid. At police headquarters, Richard faced a different kind of pressure. The police union had officially condemned his investigation into Brown and past incidents. Half his command staff had requested transfers. His father's interviews had sparked a nationwide debate about political correctness undermining police work. "You don't have to do this," his deputy chief warned. "Join the march, and you're choosing sides. Your career dash." "My career?" Richard interrupted. "My wife was assaulted. My son was endangered. And you're worried about my career?" He opened his uniform closet, staring at the crisp blue shirts and polished badges. For 20 years, this uniform had been his identity. Now he reached for civilian clothes, a simple black suit and tie. The march began at noon. Sophia and Maya led from the front, surrounded by other mothers carrying children. Behind them, the crowd stretched for blocks. Signs rose above the sea of people. "Black Mothers Matter. Reform now. Justice for all." As they approached the police station, Sophia saw familiar faces among the officers lining the route. Some looked away. Others met her gaze, a few even nodding in recognition. Then she saw Richard standing at the bottom of the station steps in his suit rather than his uniform. The crowd fell silent as Richard stepped forward. Without hesitation, he joined Sophia, taking her hand. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Atlanta's police chief, choosing to march with protesters rather than stand with his officers. "I stand here not as your police chief," Richard addressed the crowd, his voice carrying through the portable speakers, "but as a husband, a father, and a black man who has seen both sides of this broken system. Today, we march not against the police, but against the prejudices and practices that corrupt what policing should be." Maya handed him a sign that read, "Change starts within." As Richard held it up, cheers erupted from the crowd. News cameras captured the moment from every angle, a moment that would be replayed on national news for weeks to come. The march continued toward City Hall, growing larger with each block. Residents came out of their homes to join. Other officers, led by Sarah Chun, removed their badges and joined the march in civilian clothes. Even some of Richard's staunchest critics in the department watched with growing understanding. At City Hall, Sophia took the podium. The crowd fell silent as she began to speak, Marcus sleeping peacefully against her chest. "What happened to me was not unique. What was unique was that my husband had the courage to stand up and say enough. Now we're all standing up, together, saying enough." Richard stood beside her, his presence both protective and supportive. He'd chosen his side, not between police and community, but between right and wrong. As the crowd chanted for change, he knew there was no going back. The video hit social media at midnight. High-definition footage from multiple angles showing the incident in Piedmont Park. Someone had compiled security camera footage, cell phone videos, and even drone shots from a nearby photographer, creating a comprehensive view of what happened. In the police department's break room, officers gathered around screens, watching in silence. The footage was impossible to dismiss. Sophia clearly trying to comfort her crying baby, Brown's aggressive approach, the unnecessary escalation, the taser deployment, and the heart-stopping moment when Marcus fell. "Jesus Christ," Sarah Chin whispered, watching Brown reach for his taser without warning. There wasn't even an attempt to de-escalate. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had millions of views. National news networks played it on loop, often split-screen with footage of Richard joining the protest march. Commentators dissected every second, but the visual evidence left little room for interpretation. Tyler Brown sat in his lawyer's office, watching his career implode in real time. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages, some supportive, most condemning. Even his usual defenders in the union seemed hesitant after seeing the full footage. "They're hanging you out to dry," his lawyer said, scrolling through official statements. "The union's backing off. The department's investigating past incidents. Chief Carter's calling for a complete review of use of force policies." Brown's face hardened. "I followed my training. I assessed a potential threat and responded according to protocol." "If Carter wasn't married to her dash," "Stop," his lawyer interrupted. "That footage shows no threat assessment, no protocol follow-through. You tasered an unarmed mother holding a baby. The only question now is how to minimize the damage. In his office, Richard reviewed Brown's personnel file again, this time with fresh eyes. The previous complaints painted a clear pattern, a tendency to perceive threat where none existed, particularly with minorities. Each incident had been dismissed or downplayed, often with the support of supervisors who praised Brown's proactive policing. His phone buzzed with a message from Brown. "You're destroying my life over politics. You know how dangerous this job is. You know we have to make split-second decisions." Richard thought about responding, but was interrupted by Detective Rodriguez. "Chief, we found something. Brown's body cam from 3 similar incidents last month. All mothers with crying babies. All white. No tasers deployed. No force used at all. The evidence was damning. Brown's actions weren't split-second decisions. They were manifestations of deep-seated prejudices. The same prejudices Richard had fought against his entire career." At home that evening, Brown paced his living room, watching coverage of protests spreading to other cities. His phone showed notifications from former supporters distancing themselves. The union representative who'd promised to defend him now wouldn't return his calls. "You need to make a statement," his lawyer advised over the phone. "Show remorse. Acknowledge mistakes. It's your only chance at salvaging anything from this." But Brown couldn't admit he was wrong. In his mind, he'd done what he was trained to do. The fact that everyone else saw something different only reinforced his belief that he was being sacrificed to political correctness. He drafted a lengthy social media post defending his actions, claiming he was protecting public safety. As soon as he posted it, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Even fellow officers who'd initially supported him began to pull away. In the department's internal affairs office, the investigation expanded beyond the park incident. Each new revelation painted a picture of an officer who'd been enabled by a system designed to protect its own, until that system had to confront the consequences in the most personal way possible. The Internal Affairs conference room had become command central for the investigation. Wall-mounted screens displayed timelines, incident reports, and body camera footage. Tyler Brown's career history spread across the table in manila folders, each containing incidents that should have raised red flags years ago. "Officer Brown is officially suspended without pay," announced the IA director to Richard and the investigative team. "His badge and weapon have been surrendered. But Chief, this goes deeper than one officer." Richard nodded, reviewing the preliminary findings. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of supervisors dismissing complaints, of fellow officers remaining silent, of a system designed to protect itself at the expense of justice. Meanwhile, Sophia had become an unexpected voice for change. She sat in a CNN studio, Marcus sleeping in a carrier beside her, as the interviewer asked about her experience. "What happened to me happens every day," Sophia said, her voice steady. "The difference is that my husband's position forced people to pay attention. But every mother deserves that attention. Every citizen deserves that protection." The interview cut to footage from the park, followed by clips of other incidents involving Brown. Sophia watched without flinching, though her hand instinctively moved to touch Marcus. "In your husband's role in LL this?" the interviewer pressed. "How has this affected his position as police chief?" "Richard had to make a choice," Sophia replied, "between protecting a broken system and protecting the community he serves. He chose the community. Now we're asking every officer to make that same choice." Back at police headquarters, the public hearing was being prepared. The largest conference room had been converted into a makeshift courtroom, with space for media, community leaders, and department officials. Richard reviewed his opening statement, each word carefully chosen. "We're not here to judge one incident or one officer. We're here to examine a culture that allowed this to happen, that trained officers to see threats instead of humanity, that valued protection of our own over protection of the public." Sophia spent the evening before the hearing with Maya, preparing her testimony. They sat in Sophia's living room, surrounded by notes and documentation. "Remember," Maya advised, "this isn't just about what happened in the park. This is about systemic change. Your story is the catalyst, but the goal is transformation." Sophia nodded, looking at a photo of Richard in his uniform from their wedding day. "I used to be so proud of that uniform," she said quietly. Now I understand it's not about the uniform. It's about the person wearing it. The hearing room filled early the next morning. Community members packed the public seating area. Officers lined the walls, some supportive, others resistant to change, but present under orders. News cameras broadcast live to a national audience. Sophia took the stand first. Under the bright lights, she recounted that day in the park. Her voice never wavered as she described the fear, the pain, the helplessness of watching her baby fall. The room fell silent as she spoke, even the most hardened officers affected by her testimony. I don't want Officer Brown's career, she concluded. I want change. I want every officer to see me, to see all of us, as human beings first. I want them to understand that the greatest threat to public safety is the loss of public trust. The impact was immediate and powerful. Social media exploded with support. Other victims of police misconduct came forward with their stories. Department phones rang constantly with calls from other cities wanting to learn from Atlanta's response. The public hearing stretched into its second day, becoming a watershed moment for police reform in Atlanta. The chamber remained packed as community members shared their experiences, creating a tapestry of testimonies that could no longer be ignored. Richard stood at the podium, his presence commanding attention. Today, we're announcing comprehensive reforms to our department. These include mandatory de-escalation training, civilian oversight of use of force incidents, and immediate suspension of any officer showing patterns of discriminatory behavior. In the back of the room, Tyler Brown sat with his lawyer, his face tightening with each new announcement. His once pristine uniform had been replaced by a civilian suit that seemed to hang awkwardly on his frame. The evidence against him had become overwhelming, not just from the park incident, but from years of documented bias. During a break in the proceedings, Brown's lawyer received the department's final report. They have everything, Tyler. The racial disparity in your arrest, the previous complaints, the body cam footage showing different treatment based on race. We need to consider a plea deal. But Brown had reached his breaking point. Standing abruptly, he pushed through the crowd toward Richard. You're destroying everything, he shouted. You're letting them tear down the entire system because your wife couldn't control her kid. The room fell silent. Security moved forward, but Richard held up his hand, stopping them. He turned to face Brown directly. The system I'm supposedly destroying, Richard's voice carried clearly through. The chamber is the same system that taught you to see my wife as a threat. The same system that made you think it was acceptable to taser a mother holding her baby. If that system needs to be destroyed to be rebuilt, then so be it. Maya, who had been questioning witnesses, stepped forward with a tablet. Officer Brown, would you like to explain these statistics? In the past year alone, you used force against minority subjects 8 times more often than against white subjects in identical situations. Brown's face flushed. You don't understand what it's like out there. The split-second decisions we have to make split-second decisions? Sophia stood from her seat, Marcus in her arms. You watched me for 5 minutes before approaching. You had time to observe, to ask questions, to offer help. Instead, you chose to see a threat where there was only a mother trying to comfort her child. The gallery erupted in supportive murmurs. Brown looked around, suddenly aware that even his former supporters were avoiding his gaze. His last defenders in the department had gone silent after seeing the complete evidence. I'm filing a lawsuit, Brown announced desperately. Against the department, against Chief Carter, against all of you. This is a witch hunt, and I won't be your scapegoat. Richard remained calm. File your lawsuit, Officer Brown. But understand this. Every piece of evidence we've uncovered, every testimony we've heard, every video we've reviewed will become public record. Your actions and the system that enabled them will be exposed in full detail. Brown's lawyer grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, but Brown shook him off. You're all going to regret this. When officers start hesitating because they're afraid of being the next Tyler Brown, when crime rates spike because we can't do our jobs our job, Richard interrupted, his voice firm, is to protect and serve, not to terrorize, not to discriminate, and certainly not to assault mothers and endanger children. If you don't understand the difference, you never should have worn the badge. The hearing room erupted in applause, drowning out Brown's further protests. As security finally led him away, the message was clear. The old system of unquestioned police authority was crumbling, and a new era of accountability was beginning. The press conference room at Atlanta Police Headquarters buzzed with anticipation. Richard and Sophia stood together at the podium, their united presence a powerful symbol of the changes sweeping through the department. Behind them, a diverse group of officers and community leaders showed their support. Today, we announce the indictment of former Officer Tyler Brown on charges of aggravated assault and reckless endangerment, Richard began, his voice steady. But more importantly, we're announcing fundamental changes to our police department. Sophia stepped forward, Marcus secure in her arms. What happened to me became a catalyst, but this moment isn't about one incident or one officer. It's about transforming a system that has failed too many for too long. Across town, Tyler Brown watched the press conference on his television, alone in his apartment. His lawyer had just informed him that the police union had officially withdrawn their support. His lawsuit threats had crumbled in the face of overwhelming evidence. The indictment meant he would face criminal charges, with the possibility of jail time. Back at headquarters, Richard outlined the reforms. Effective immediately, we're implementing new use-of-force protocols, mandatory de-escalation training, and a civilian oversight board with real power. Every officer will undergo implicit bias training, not as a one-time event, but as an ongoing requirement. The changes weren't just on paper. Within the department, officers like Sarah Chun were being promoted to leadership positions, bringing fresh perspectives to old problems. The old guard, including some of Richard's longest-serving G commanders, had been given a choice: adapt to the new standards or retire. Maya, standing with the community leaders, addressed the legal implications. We're establishing a special unit to review past cases of police misconduct. This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability and reconciliation. The reforms sent ripples through law enforcement nationwide. Other cities began requesting Atlanta's new training protocols. Police chiefs from across the country called Richard for advice on implementing similar changes. The Atlanta model became a blueprint for police reform. Sophia's role evolved beyond victim to advocate. She established a foundation supporting families affected by police misconduct, while also working with officers committed to change. Her story became required reading in police academies, a testament to the cost of unchecked bias and the importance of seeing humanity in every encounter. Richard's father, watching the press conference from his retirement home, finally saw what his son had been trying to tell him for years. He wrote a letter to Richard. "I was wrong. What we built wasn't strength. It was fear disguised as authority. You're building something better." The press room grew quiet as Richard concluded. "A year ago, my wife was assaulted and my son endangered by an officer who saw threat instead of humanity. Today, we're not just changing policies, we're changing culture. We're building a department that serves all citizens, that sees people before prejudice, that understands true strength lies in protection, not power." In the weeks that followed, Tyler Brown pleaded guilty to reduced charges, accepting responsibility as part of a plea deal that required him to participate in bias education programs. His case became a teaching tool in police training, an example of how quickly judgment could be clouded by prejudice. Sophia and Richard walked through Piedmont Park one evening, Marcus now walking beside them. The place that had been a scene of trauma had become a symbol of transformation. Other families smiled and waved, some stopping to share their own stories of change they'd witnessed in police interactions. "Do you think it will last?" Sophia asked, watching Marcus chase a butterfly. Richard squeezed her hand. "Change isn't just about rules or training. It's about people willing to stand up and say enough. You did that. We did that. And now others are doing the same." As the sun set over Atlanta, the park filled with families enjoying the evening without fear. Among them were off-duty officers, no longer separate from the community, but part of it. The barrier between protector and protected had begun to dissolve, replaced by a shared understanding that true safety comes from mutual respect and recognition of our common humanity. The story of Sophia and Richard Carter became more than a headline. It became a turning point, a moment when one incident sparked a movement, when personal pain led to public transformation, and when a city showed the world that change was possible if people were brave enough to demand it and wise enough to work for it together.